Ne güzel bir gün. Burada oturup dinlenmek çok iyi gelecek.
I'm sitting in the Tijuana bus terminal at 2:47 a.m. with a duffel bag and $23 in my wallet. My phone died 6 hours ago. I've been asking strangers if they speak English, trying to figure out how to get to the border crossing. The woman at the ticket counter keeps shaking her head when I show her my empty debit card. 3 years ago, I crossed this same border in the opposite direction with $180,000 and a business plan. I thought I was building my retirement. I was financing my own destruction. My name is Robert, and I'm 62 years old. 3 years ago, I was a recently widowed small business owner from Denver, Colorado. Sarah had passed away from cancer after 34 years of marriage. The medical bills ate through most of our savings, but when I sold my plumbing supply company, I walked away with $180,000. Not enough to retire comfortably in Colorado, but enough to start fresh somewhere the dollar stretched further. I'd been researching retirement destinations for months. Thailand seemed too foreign. Costa Rica felt overdone. Then I found Merida, Mexico. Safe, affordable, growing expat community. Colonial architecture, perfect weather year-round. I could rent a nice place for $800 a month, live well on $3,000. My money would last 15 years, maybe 20 if I was careful. The flight from Denver to Merida was the first time I'd traveled alone since Sarah died. I remember looking out the window as we descended, seeing the white limestone buildings, and thinking this might actually work. At 62, starting over felt impossible in the States. Here, it felt like an adventure. I rented a furnished 2-bedroom house in the Centro Histórico for $900 a month, more than I'd planned, but I wanted to be walking distance from everything. The first month was exactly what I'd hoped for. Morning coffee on my terrace, afternoon walks through the markets, evening meals at local restaurants where a full dinner cost $8. I was spending maybe $2,500 a month, well within budget. The expat community was smaller than I'd expected, but friendly. Most were retirees like me, living on fixed incomes, happy to have someone new to show around. I joined a weekly poker game, started taking Spanish lessons, even signed up for salsa dancing classes. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis 3 years earlier, I felt optimistic about the future. That's where I met Diego. He was 31, spoke perfect English, and always seemed to know everyone wherever we went. While the other expats talked about their pensions and health problems, Diego talked about opportunities, coffee exports, artisan crafts, real estate development. He'd grown up in Merida but studied business in Mexico City. His family had connections throughout the Yucatan. The problem with most Americans who come here, he told me one evening over beers, is they think too small. They come to spend money, not make money. But there are incredible opportunities if you know the right people. I was intrigued. My $180,000 was enough to live on, but barely. If I could grow it, maybe I wouldn't have to worry about every expense. Maybe I could actually enjoy retirement instead of just surviving it. Diego started showing me around Merida differently. Not the tourist spots, but the business districts. The new developments going up on the outskirts of the city. The coffee farms in the mountains 2 hours south. He had ideas, and more importantly, he had contacts. I've been developing a business plan, he told me one afternoon. Coffee export to the US, small batch, high quality, direct from farmers to specialty roasters. The margins are incredible, but I need capital to get started. He showed me spreadsheets on his laptop, purchase prices from farmers, shipping costs, contacts at roasters in Austin and Portland. The numbers looked impressive. Buy coffee at $3 per pound, sell at $12. Even accounting for shipping, permits, and overhead, we could double our money every 6 months. How much capital are we talking about? I asked. To start small and prove the concept, maybe $45,000. That covers our first 3 shipments. establishes relationships, gets the paperwork in order. Once we prove it works, we can scale up. $45,000 was exactly 25% of my savings. A significant risk, but not catastrophic if it failed. And Diego's confidence was infectious. He'd spent hours explaining the business, introducing me to his contacts, showing me the coffee farms. Everything seemed legitimate. What would my role be, I asked. Equal partners, he said without hesitation. You provide the capital, I provide the local knowledge and relationships. We split everything 50-50. I should have asked more questions. I should have hired a lawyer to review contracts. I should have done independent research on coffee export regulations. Instead, I was seduced by the idea of being needed again, of having a purpose beyond just spending down my savings. 2 weeks later, I transferred $45,000 to a business account Diego had set up, Exportadora Yucatan, LLC. He showed me the incorporation papers, the tax registration, even got me a business card with my name as Socio Fundador, founding partner. For the first 2 months, everything went according to plan. Diego took me to meet coffee farmers in the mountains. We sampled beans, negotiated prices, talked about quality control. I met his cousin who handled logistics, his friend who managed customs documentation. Everyone was professional, knowledgeable, eager to work with us. Our first shipment was 500 pounds of beans to a specialty roaster in Austin. Diego handled all the paperwork while I watched our inventory move from farm to processing facility to shipping container. When the payment came through, $6,000 for coffee that cost us $2,800, I felt like we'd struck gold. This is just the beginning, Diego said, showing me emails from 3 more roasters interested in our product. We could be shipping 2,000 pounds a month by year end. I was hooked, not just on the money, but on being part of something growing, something successful. For the first time since Sarah's death, I felt like I was building towards something instead of just waiting. That's when Diego presented the expansion opportunity. I've got a chance to lock in contracts with 5 roasters, he told me. Guaranteed orders for the next 12 months. But we need to put down deposits with the farmers to secure that volume of high-quality beans. The numbers were compelling. $85,000 in deposits would secure $280,000 in confirmed orders. We'd triple our money in a year, assuming we could handle the logistics. It's a big step up, Diego admitted, but these kinds of opportunities don't come around often. If we don't take it, someone else will. I hesitated. $85,000 would bring my total investment to $130,000, leaving me only $50,000 in emergency savings. But the projected returns were enormous, and I trusted Diego. We'd already proven the business model worked. Show me the contracts, I said. Diego produced emails from roasters, purchase orders with letterheads, payment schedules. Everything looked official. I recognized 2 of the company names from coffee shops I'd visited in Denver. These weren't fly-by-night operations. One thing, Diego said as I prepared to transfer the money, these deposits need to go directly to the farmers. It's how they prefer to do business down here. Cash up front, beans delivered to our warehouse for processing and shipping. Something felt off about that, but Diego's explanation made sense. We were dealing with small family farms that didn't have the capital to invest in inventory. They needed payment up front to cover harvesting and processing costs. I transferred the $85,000 to accounts Diego provided. Different farmers, different banks, but he assured me this was normal. Each farm has their own banking relationships, he explained. It's more efficient this way. For a week, everything seemed fine. Diego showed me photos from the farms, talked about harvest timelines, shared updates on shipping schedules. Then the delays started. One of the farmers is having trouble with his processing equipment, Diego told me. Nothing major, just a 2-week delay on his portion of the order. Then it was permit issues with customs. Then quality problems with one batch that had to be rejected. Then truck problems preventing deliveries from the mountain farms. Always something small. Always with a reasonable explanation. Always just a temporary setback. By month 3, we'd shipped nothing. Diego had excuses for everything, but no products were moving. When I demanded to visit the farmers directly, he explained that the harvest season had ended and they were preparing fields for next year. We can visit during the next harvest, he said. Right now there's nothing to see. I should have demanded my money back then. But Diego was so convincing, so apologetic, so confident that everything would work out. He showed me updated contracts, revised shipping schedules, emails from roasters agreeing to wait for our premium product. The coffee business is seasonal, he reminded me. These delays happen. The important thing is maintaining quality. Our reputation depends on delivering exactly what we promise. Month 4 arrived with more delays, equipment failures, weather problems, regulatory changes. Diego always had documentation to support his explanations, but we still hadn't shipped a single pound of coffee since our initial test batch. That's when I started doing my own research. I contacted the roasters Diego claimed were waiting for our products. The first 2 had never heard of Exportadora Yucatan. The third said they'd received some sample emails but never committed to any orders. None had signed the contracts Diego had shown me. I drove to the coffee farms we'd supposedly partnered with. The first farm existed, but the owner said he'd never met Diego. He sold his coffee through a cooperative and had no individual export relationships. The second farm had the right name, but was owned by a different family. They'd never heard of our business. When I confronted Diego with this information, he didn't deny it. He just looked tired. Roberto, I tried to make it work, he said. The coffee business is harder than I thought. Too much competition, too much red tape. I've been using new investment to pay back previous commitments while I figured out how to pivot. What does that mean? I demanded. It means I spent your money trying to keep the business alive until I could find a way to make it profitable. I never meant to lie to you. Where is my $130,000? He pulled out a notebook and showed me ledger entries. Payments to farmers who didn't exist. Shipping costs for deliveries that never happened. Equipment purchases with no equipment to show for it. According to his records, we'd spent $112,000 on business expenses and had $18,000 remaining in various accounts. I can show you all the receipts, he said. Everything I spent was for the business. But when I demanded to see the receipts, half were missing. The other half were for legitimate business expenses. Office supplies, phone bills, gas for his truck, but nothing that added up to $112,000. That's when I understood. There had never been a coffee export business. There had never been farmer partnerships or roaster contracts. Diego had created an elaborate fiction to justify taking my money, probably spending it on personal expenses while feeding me fake updates to buy time. I can pay you back, he promised. I've got other opportunities. Real estate deals, a restaurant partnership. Give me 6 months. I should have gone to the police immediately. Instead, I gave him 2 weeks to produce a repayment plan. I was still hoping to recover something, still believing that this was a business failure rather than outright fraud. Diego disappeared 3 days later. His apartment was empty, his phone disconnected. None of his supposed business contacts had current information about his whereabouts. The cousin who handled logistics, the friend who managed customs, they'd never existed. I'd been talking to Diego the entire time, using different names and backstories depending on which role the conversation required. I sat in my rented house that night, doing math on paper. I'd started with $180,000. I'd spent about $30,000 on living expenses over 8 months. I'd lost $130,000 to Diego's fake business. I had $20,000 left. At 62 years old, with $20,000 to my name, I had two choices. I could stay in Mexico and stretch that money as far as possible, maybe 2 years if I lived extremely cheaply, or I could go back to the United States and try to rebuild. But going back meant admitting complete failure. It meant explaining to my few remaining friends why I'd lost everything. It meant finding work at 62 with no recent employment history and no references who could vouch for my judgment. I decided to stay and make the $20,000 last as long as possible. I moved out of my nice house in the Centro and rented a single room in a boarding house for $200 a month. I stopped eating at restaurants and bought groceries at the local market. I cancelled my Spanish lessons, quit the poker games, avoided anywhere I might run into other expats who knew about my business venture with Diego. For 6 months, I lived like a ghost. My $20,000 became $15,000, then $10,000, then $5,000. I started skipping meals. I stopped paying for air conditioning to save on electric bills. When my phone service got cut off for non-payment, I didn't renew it. I began to understand what real poverty felt like. Not the temporary cash flow problems I'd experienced during difficult months with my plumbing business, but the grinding daily anxiety of not knowing where next month's rent would come from. By month 14, I was down to my last $1,200. I'd already been evicted from the boarding house and was sleeping in a youth hostel that charged $8 per night. Even that was becoming unaffordable. I knew I had to go home, but I couldn't afford a plane ticket. A one-way flight to Denver cost $420, money I needed for food and shelter. I started asking other Americans if they could lend me money, promising to pay them back once I got to the States and found work. Nobody believed me. A 63-year-old man begging for loan money doesn't inspire confidence, especially when he can't provide references or explain what happened to his previous resources without admitting to spectacular financial mismanagement. That's how I ended up at the Tijuana bus station with $23, hoping to cross the border and somehow make it to Denver without money for transportation, food, or shelter. I'd bought a bus ticket from Merida to Tijuana with my last significant cash, thinking I could walk across the border and figure out the rest once I was back in the United States. But the border crossing required proper documentation and enough money to prove I wasn't going to become a burden on U.S. social services. The immigration officer looked at my passport, then at my empty wallet, then back at me. "Sir, you need to demonstrate that you have sufficient funds to support yourself upon entry to the United States." "I'm a U.S. citizen." I said. "I'm just trying to get home." "I understand, but you still need to show adequate financial resources. Do you have a bank account, credit cards, someone who can vouch for your financial stability?" I had nothing. My bank account was overdrawn. My credit cards were maxed out and cancelled. I had no family to call, no friends who would wire me money after 2 years of no contact. "Is there someone you can contact?" the officer asked, more gently now. I thought about my situation. I was 63 years old, broke, stranded in a foreign country, with no way to prove I could support myself if allowed back into the United States. I'd lost $160,000 to a con man and spent the last year living like a vagrant, too proud to ask for help until it was too late. "No," I admitted, "there's nobody." The officer directed me to a waiting area and said someone from the consulate would speak with me about emergency assistance options. I spent the next 6 hours explaining my situation to various officials, each one asking the same questions about how I'd ended up in this predicament. Finally, a consular officer named Janet sat down across from me. "Mr. Peterson, we can help you get back to the United States," she said. "We have emergency assistance programs for citizens in distress, but I need you to understand that this will require repayment once you're back on your feet." "How much?" I asked. "The emergency loan for transportation and temporary assistance would be about $800. You'd sign an agreement to repay the government once you have stable income. $800, the amount I used to spend on a weekend getaway with Sarah. Now it represented my lifeline back to a country where I had nothing waiting for me. What happens when I get to Denver? I asked. That's up to you, Janet said. We can get you there, but you'll need to figure out housing, employment, healthcare. Do you have any contacts who might be able to help? I didn't. In 2 years of chasing my retirement fantasy in Mexico, I'd burned every bridge and exhausted every relationship. My few friends had tried to stay in touch initially, but I'd been too embarrassed to maintain contact once things started going wrong. I'll figure it out, I said. 3 days later, I was on a Greyhound bus from San Diego to Denver with a government-issued emergency travel document and $47 in cash for food during the 36-hour journey. I arrived in Denver with nothing but the clothes in my duffel bag and a debt to the US government that I had no idea how to repay. The city looked familiar but felt foreign. I'd been gone for 2 years, but it felt like 20. I spent my first night back in America at a homeless shelter, lying on a cot next to men whose stories weren't so different from mine. Job loss, health problems, bad decisions, family breakdowns. The common thread wasn't drugs or alcohol or mental illness, though those were represented. It was the discovery that the margin between stability and destitution was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. At 63, with no recent work history, no references, and no fixed address, finding employment seemed impossible. But I had one advantage. I knew plumbing. I'd spent 35 years in the business before selling my company. My hands still remembered how to work. I started by offering to fix small problems for cash: clogged drains, leaky faucets, running toilets. I'd hang around hardware stores and offer to help homeowners who looked confused in the plumbing aisles. $5 here, $10 there, enough to buy food and eventually rent a room in a boarding house. Gradually, word spread. The old guy who did good plumbing work for cheap. I wasn't licensed anymore and couldn't do major installations, but I could handle repairs and maintenance. It was enough to survive. 6 months after returning to Denver, I had steady income, a permanent address, and enough money to start paying back my government debt. I wasn't thriving, but I wasn't begging strangers for bus fare either. The hardest part wasn't the money or the work. It was accepting what I'd become. I'd spent my entire adult life building toward a comfortable retirement with Sarah. When she died, I thought I could reconstruct that future in a place where my money would stretch further and my loneliness would matter less. Instead, I'd handed my life savings to a stranger who saw me coming from a mile away. A lonely widower with money and no local connections, desperate to believe that someone needed his partnership and valued his judgment. Diego hadn't targeted me because I was an American. He'd targeted me because I was vulnerable. The same scheme would have worked on any recently divorced retiree, any small business owner looking for a fresh start, anyone with savings and a need to feel useful again. I don't hate Mexico. I don't blame the country for what happened to me. Mexico was just the stage where I learned that desperation makes you stupid and loneliness makes you reckless. The coffee export business could have been based anywhere. The con could have happened in Thailand, Costa Rica, or Portugal. The location wasn't the problem. The problem was a 62-year-old man who mistook kindness for friendship and attention for opportunity. If you're thinking about starting over somewhere new, with money you can't afford to lose, just remember this: the people who approach you with opportunities aren't drawn by your business acumen. They're drawn by your bank account and your need to believe that someone sees your value. I'm 65 now. I rent a 1-bedroom apartment, drive a 15-year-old pickup truck, and do plumbing repairs for people who pay in cash. It's not the retirement I planned with Sarah, but it's honest work that pays for food and shelter. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in Denver, taken a part-time job, lived modestly on my $180,000 until Social Security kicked in. I'd probably have a small house, a reliable car, maybe enough money to visit Sarah's grave on her birthday. Instead, I spent 2 years learning that the American dream doesn't travel well, especially when you're chasing it in someone else's country with money you can't afford to lose. The bus station in Tijuana feels like a lifetime ago, but it was only 2 years. 2 years between confident expatriate and broke vagrant, between business partner and mark, between building a future and begging strangers for help. That's how long it takes to lose everything, when you mistake wanting something to work for knowing how to make it work.